We are starting again. Hope you had coffee and walk a little bit. So let's start. Please take your seats so we can start. Okay. So after our introductory session, we are now going to have our senior lecture for today. I am very proud to introduce you Professor Eric Larson from Princeton University, the famous Princeton University. We are very glad that he was able to come here and to share with us all his experience with this area of energy, specifically bioenergy. Okay. Professor Larson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Suani. Thank you, Jose, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I should give a little bit of an introduction to myself to set the context for what I'm going to talk about. I'm with the Energy Systems Analysis Group within it's called the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. And you'll notice it's the Energy Systems Analysis Group, not the Bioenergy Systems Analysis Group. And that means that we work on lots of different energy issues. So over the course of, now I've been with this group for almost 35 years, and we've worked on bioenergy, but we've worked on wind energy, we've worked on hydrogen, we've worked on energy efficiency, we've worked on nuclear energy, fossil energy. So we're interested in solving energy-related environmental problems and wherever that takes us. And it happened to take me to Brazil for the first time in 1984 when I was starting to study the energy use in the sugarcane industry. And I've had the opportunity to visit many countries where sugarcane is produced and sugar and ethanol are produced. And so I've had a chance to see how things work around the world. And I have to say that Brazil is always the highlight of that sugar processing world. And most of what I know about sugarcane I've learned from people like Suani and others here in Brazil. So my approach, so what we do in my group is to think about technologies that generally haven't been used in particular applications, and then think about how they might be repurposed for solving an energy problem. So for example, in the sugarcane industry, we did a lot of analysis around gasification of bagasse with use in syngas in a gas turbine for power generation. And this idea has been mentioned previously here at the workshop. It's still a technology under development, but it looked quite interesting when we were examining it. I've also done some work in the pulp and paper industry, which is another bioenergy, an important bioenergy producer both in Brazil and also in the United States. So let me ask, how many of you here are studying bioenergy specifically at your universities? Okay, so a few of you, all right. And how many of you are chemical engineers? Mechanical engineers? Not engineers. Okay, all right. So that gives me a little starting point. Okay, so I'm going to speak, and a lot of the issues that I'm going to touch on have already been touched on, but biomass is an interesting and complicated energy resource, and I think I'll have a different perspective, which I hope will help your understanding of some of these complicated issues. And I'm going to start by talking about what I think is the distinguishing characteristics of biomass compared to other renewables. So biomass is the only carbon-carrying renewable energy source, right? Photosynthesis converts CO2 from the atmosphere into stored carbonaceous energy, and then when we use that energy, the CO2 goes back to the atmosphere. So, in principle, it's a closed, sustainable system, and that fact that biomass carries carbon is very important when we're talking about particularly things like biofuels, where you want high energy density in a fuel. The other important thing, and I'll talk more about this at my second lecture today, is the idea that you can get negative emissions with bioenergy. So if you store the carbon from the atmosphere in the biomass, use some of that energy in the biomass for energy, for fuel or electricity, but you can also capture some of the byproduct CO2 and store that underground, you now have a negative emissions energy source. And that may be important in the longer term in stabilizing our climate. And that technology, people refer to it as BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And the last distinguishing value of biomass is that it's probably the most contentious renewable energy source because of all the complications that come with it and the fact that it's so closely tied to land use. So there's a lot to think about and a lot to be attentive to as you're trying to develop bioenergy projects. So here's an outline, a quick outline of what I want to talk about, and please raise your hand and ask questions along the way, especially if something I've said is not clear. I think there'll be plenty of time for discussion, so and I'd rather have you ask the question when it occurs to you. So I called, how many know this book, A Tale of Two Cities? Okay, who wrote that? Charles Dickens? Yeah. So A Tale of Two Cities is a famous novel that begins, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's the first line of the book, and I think bioenergy is in some sense that, and I'll tell you why I think that. We'll talk a little bit about photosynthesis and its limitations. Charlie Kinoshita talked about this a bit yesterday. And I'll talk about what I think are the sort of the sustainable biomass resources. There are some that are unsustainable. And then go into the sustainability issues. And all of these have been mentioned again, but I'll give you my perspective on each of these. And if I have a little time at the end, I'll touch just a little bit on algae. The question mark is both because I'm not sure I'll have time and because I'm not sure how promising algae is certainly in the current state, but maybe in the longer term. I won't spend time on this because you've seen it already, but I think this is global primary energy use. And when you're dealing with energy, you have to be careful about distinguishing primary versus secondary versus final energy. And the distributions will look quite different. I think Charlie in his slides yesterday showed final energy use. This is primary energy. And you can see that biomass is about 10% of total global primary energy use today. And it's split about equally between traditional and modern bioenergy. And the total in terms of exajoules is about 60 exajoules per year of bioenergy that's used in all forms. And if you compare that with how much biomass is produced on the Earth every year, it's quite a small fraction. So something like 2,000 exajoules. And the tale of two cities is these two cities here, traditional and modern, right? So this is the poorer city where biomass is used in traditional ways, and this is the fraction. The data is about 10 years old now, but this is the fraction of residential energy that's biomass in different parts of the world. And you can see in parts of Africa, the majority, most of the energy used in the homes is traditional biomass, and other regions also. And the consequences of this are that you have serious health, indoor air pollution damage, and particularly for women and children, and it's estimated that close to 3 million premature deaths a year because of the way biomass is used indoors. And it also results in reduced opportunities for more productive activities, either education or income earning, and again, it particularly affects women and children. So this is the sort of the dark side, I would say, of bioenergy. So modernizing bioenergy, to begin to think about that, you have to start with photosynthesis, which is what creates the biomass to begin with. And this comparison of different renewable energy sources, and this is now for electricity production, the amount of electricity, the amount of land that you need per megawatt of electric power generation. And with biomass, it's something like on the order of 200 to 300, depending on what technologies you're using, hectares per megawatt of power generation. And that's much higher than solar, much higher than wind. With hydro, if you're putting a dam in the Amazon, you might be on the high side here, but in most hydro cases, it's quite small as well. So this is for electricity production. This is if you're making hydrogen fuel. So you can use any of these sources to make hydrogen as say a transportation fuel. And the same kind of comparisons, the amount of land that you need is much higher with biomass. And that of course has many consequences that we've heard about already yesterday and this morning. So how efficiently, and Charlie showed some numbers, I'm going to give you my take on how you go through in estimating the efficiency of solar energy. So here's the reaction that turns water and CO2 into glucose and oxygen and spits out some additional water. So what's interesting here is you can see that you start with 12 molecules of water, but you end up sort of not using 6 of them. But those 6 are required in order to make this process work, and so you have a lot of water requirements in this process, and we'll get into some of the details of that as we go along. So plants, of the sunlight coming in, they only use what's called the photosynthetically active radiation. That's basically the visible light from 0.4 to 0.7 microns. And PAR accounts for about half of the incoming sunlight. So plants use only about half of the incoming solar energy. And they don't use 100% of it, they only absorb about 80% of it. So you can see we're starting to reduce from 100% of solar energy coming down to the earth, we're starting to reduce the amount that ends up being stored in the biomass. So the glucose that's formed here contains about almost 30% of the absorbed photon energy. So again, we're losing some additional amount of energy there. And then of the energy that's stored as glucose, about 40% of it is used for what's called dark respiration. That's at nighttime, you re-release some of that energy to keep the metabolism going. And so the maximum photosynthetic efficiency, you can just go through and do the math with each of these numbers, and you come out with about 6 to 7% efficient conversion of sunlight at the surface of the earth to stored glucose or biomass energy. Now this relates primarily to what's called C4 plants. So C4 plants are those where the first photosynthetic product is a 4-carbon sugar instead of a 3-carbon sugar. And these C4 plants are things like sugarcane and corn and sorghum that grow best in hot climates. If you think about C3 plants, which are grasses and trees primarily, that makes up about 95% of the biomass around the world. The maximum storage efficiency there is about half of what it is for C4 plants. All right. So with this efficiency number, we can do some interesting little calculations. So if you take you ask the question, how much biomass could we make at a spot on Earth, given this kind of efficiency? And I picked an example of in the UK, which is at about a 50-degree north latitude, and the average incident solar energy at the surface is about 11 megajoules per square meter per day. You do the math, 11 megajoules per square meter per day, convert that at 3.3% efficiency, and you get about 1,300 gigajoules per hectare per year. All right. So that number probably doesn't mean much to most of you. It doesn't mean much to me unless I see something to compare it against. So biomass typically is going to have an energy content of roughly 17 to 18 gigajoules per dry ton. And so with this many gigajoules per hectare, you get about 76 dry tons per hectare per year is what you would expect for a maximum biomass production at this spot in the UK. If you look at another place closer to my home, this is in Iowa, which is in the middle of the United States, which is the big corn growing part of the United States. It's at a lower latitude, has some additional solar energy coming down on average, and so we would expect something like 100 tons per hectare per year that we could produce in Iowa. So let's compare this number to what we actually produce in Iowa, the corn growing capital of the US. So this is the corn grain yield in kilograms per hectare over time in Iowa, and you could probably show graphs like this for sugarcane in Brazil or Colombia or other places. And it's been steadily climbing for various reasons, through various genetic modifications, through fertilizer applications, and so on. And we're up to as of 2010, it was about 8 dry tons per hectare per year of corn grain, which is what is measured typically. And there's roughly a ton of what's called corn stover, the fiber that goes with the corn grain, per ton of grain. So that means a total above ground biomass production of about 16 tons per hectare per year. Yes? Sorry, I've got a microphone here. I'm going to make these guys work this time. Oh, here.
Thank you. My name is Diana. I'm from Colombia. I'm sorry, can you go back one slide, please? I feel like a little loose when you talk about energy. Do you mean this energy? It's for when you burn the, when you use the dry biomass for burn and produce electricity, or this energy is related is related about what? I didn't understand that. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. It's the heating value of the biomass, the raw biomass. So if you burn that completely, you would release that amount of heat. Right? Other questions?
Okay. This heating value, it's the heating value after or before you vaporize all the water?
So that's a good question, and this is a question that most people who first encounter biomass don't consider seriously enough, right? So biomass, when you cut it fresh, it has about 50% water in it. Sugarcane, maybe more. But you can dry the water out, and right? So this heating value, I've expressed it in per dry ton. Okay, so it could have half water in it, but this is per dry ton. So you have to specify what the moisture content is that you're referring to when you...
So this dry ton there doesn't have any water.
Right. If you took a piece of biomass and dried it completely,
Okay.
this would be what the energy that would be released. But it's a way of talking about the same piece of biomass even with the water in it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Another one.
Hello. It's about the next slide, about the, yeah. So you said like we are producing more per hectare, but in the same time, like, are you considering that there is more inputs, more fertilizer?
So this is just strictly how much biomass is being produced above ground.
Yeah, but now in 2005, I think we are producing more, but we are also putting more fertilizer and more inputs.
Yes.
So at the end, the energy balance, I don't know if it's still the same.
Well, so here it's a good question, and I'll come back to the energy balance with fertilizer later. But right now, I wanted to illustrate how, so let's see. So I wanted you to keep this number in your head, that there are you would expect 100 tons per hectare per year to be producible on sort of maximum efficiency in Iowa, but what we're actually producing is about 16, even with all of this effort to add fertilizer and so on. So we're only producing 16 instead of 100, so a factor of 10 below the maximum efficiency, which is already rather low. And so the question is, what are we missing in this calculation of the photosynthetic efficiency? What have I not taken into account here? Any thoughts? Right, so the area is not completely covered, meaning the canopy of the biomass is not occupying every square meter. That's it, that's part of it. Yep. What else? Should we have the mic? Okay.
It was more like a question whether the photosynthesis happens on the whole plant or only on specific parts of the...
Well, that would be similar to the canopy cover, I think. Are you intercepting all of the solar energy or only part of it? So if you have a very thin plant or a very broad one, the broad one will collect more solar energy, right? So the canopy cover is an important piece. Any other suggestions? The lifetime. 24 hours, right? Well, let's see, the average solar incidence, right, it's
just like when you make a calculation, usually if photoscience is efficient, you count like 24 hours, like always have light and not the not the real thing.
And even so related to that, is the temperature also. There are parts of the year where the temperature is not warm enough to grow things, right? So I'll give you the 5 factors that low temperatures. So below about 5 degrees C, you can't grow something. So that maximum calculation assumed we were getting solar energy year-round and plants could grow year-round. If we don't have enough water, we're not going to be able to photosynthesize effectively. Nutrients, fertilizer, and so on. You'll have insects and diseases that will cut down on the amount of production, and then the incomplete canopy closure, which was the one that you had mentioned. So there are many things that reduce the maximum theoretical efficiency of biomass production. And so if we look at just temperature alone, so let's say that in the temperate regions that I was talking about in the UK and in Iowa, you have maybe a 5-month period where you can actually have warm enough temperatures to grow things. It also happens that the solar radiation is much stronger in those months, so you have more solar energy input. So you're taking that into account, you would have, say, a maximum production of 76 tons per hectare per year, but we're going to have much more sunlight coming in, but we're only going to have it for part of the year. And we end up with 50 tons per hectare per year just by the growing season, has cut by 1/3 from the maximum, right? And in Des Moines, Iowa, the same kind of calculation, we go from 100 tons down to 60 tons, right? So there we go. Overall, with practical considerations, you think the battery might be done? Oh, okay. We'll struggle along here. So with practical considerations, it's about 1% efficiency for C3 plants and maybe 2 to 3% for C4 plants. All right. So we're struggling to against photosynthetic efficiency when we're working with biomass. All right. So on top of that, then we have to look at what kind of land is suitable for growing biomass. And this is a map that shows where you have enough rain to grow crops of some sort, and you have the right kind of soils and climate generally. So the yellow is unsuited for agriculture. So you have deserts, for example, that are not, you can't grow things there. You have closed forests like the Amazon, and in sub-Saharan Africa, there are large places where you don't want to grow. And so you're left with the sort of the blue and the green areas is a much smaller fraction of the Earth's land that's available for growing things than we might like. And so if you think about trying to provide all of the energy that we use in the world from biomass, total primary energy consumption in the world is about 600 exajoules per year. Everybody know what an exajoule is? 10 to the 18th, right? It's a big number, okay? So if we were to produce biomass at, say, an average of 15 tons per hectare per year, we would need about 2.5 billion hectares of land to supply all of our primary energy needs. And globally, the total land area is about 13 billion. The amount of cropland that we have today is about 1.5 billion. Forests are about 4 billion, and then permanent pasture is about 3 billion. So it's infeasible that we're going to supply all of our energy at the rate that we use it today from biomass. But there are ways that we can be smart about using biomass, be efficient about it, and we can also, importantly, reduce this number with the efficiency of how we use energy. So it's not going to, biomass won't save the world in terms of energy, but it can have an important role to play. So the sources of biomass I use the term first generation and second generation slightly differently than Charlie did, and I don't think there's a standard definition here, but first generation I refer to as depending on the source of the biomass. So first generation is basically food biomass, and second generation is lignocellulosic non-food biomass, right? So with food biomass, it's been optimized over time for food production, not for energy production. And so it works for food, for energy, but it's really been optimized for food. And in the case of sugarcane in Brazil, that's starting to change a little bit because of the big ethanol program here. there are probably varieties of cane that are more optimized for ethanol than for sugar. But in the end, we're only converting a portion of the plant in most cases. For example, in the US, it's corn ethanol primarily. We're only converting the corn. We're leaving half of the biomass on the land or doing something else with it. So it's not, again, not optimized. And then we're competing with food. And so that can lead to higher cost bioenergy and higher cost food. And so ultimately, I consider most first generation biomass sources as not sustainable for these reasons. And I would make an exception for sugarcane in Brazil for sure. Second generation is lignocellulosic, and these are generally not edible, and so there's less competition with food. On the same token, the reason they're not edible is because they're difficult to digest, which makes it harder to convert into energy in some cases. But we do use most of the plant for energy, so we're getting better use out of the land. And we can customize the plants for energy, optimize them for energy rather than for other purposes. So these, I would say, are easier to make sustainable. They're not automatically sustainable, but they're easier to make sustainable. So this is kind of a map of the sustainable sources of biomass, sort of a simplified look at it. This is from the Global Energy Assessment. And incidentally, I try on all of my slides to give you the references, so if you're interested, you can follow up and find the original material. So this is, for example, land that's used to make food or fodder. Fodder is animal feed. Some of that, the harvest of that food can result in residues that become usable for energy. Some of that goes for food and animal production and so on, but you could have secondary residues coming out and being used for energy. You have food consumption, which can generate some waste and end up with additional residues for energy. And so we've seen examples of all of these from Swanee and Charlie already. You can have pastures that are used for animal feed, but then you also have abandoned agricultural land that is no longer suitable for agriculture, basically because its productivity has been exhausted, but it still can grow something, and that could be an energy crop that's used. You can have land that's for forestry, and again used for fiber production or for wood production, but you can have residues from that, from the harvest process, that go to energy. You can have material that's, when you're producing, for example, logs and boards, you produce a lot of sawdust and waste wood, which is good for energy. And then similarly, consumption of materials, and you have these primary, secondary, and tertiary residues. These are all, I would say, sustainable. And then you have this other category, both land and sea, where you could grow dedicated energy crops. And that's a direct energy, a bioenergy source. And this one, depending on how you do it, it may or may not be sustainable. So these generation 2 feedstocks then, so crop residues, primary and secondary, it's pretty easy to estimate how much biomass you could get from a, oh, looks like I have a question here, yeah.
Hi, Professor. You are talking about sustainable and unsustainable production in the previous slide. What did you mean with it? Because at least from the next one, there is some ways to make it sustainable. Okay, it will be more difficult. You have more difficulty to use tertiary residues from food, from the population, but it's technical possible. It's, but what did you mean when you said, okay, it's not sustainable?
That's an excellent question, because sustainable means different things to different people, for sure. And I think in this, and in fact, it's going to mean different things in different parts of my talk. So, but sustainable in this case is that this is being produced regardless of whether you want it for energy or not. There's always a stream of this coming, and so in that sense, it's sustainable here. But then there are these sustainability metrics that I'll talk about, water and land and greenhouse gas emissions and so on, and economics of the system that are all also important in terms of being a sustainable energy carrier in the end. So it's a complicated term, sustainable. So with crop residues, you can estimate roughly how much biomass you can get, typically using these residue ratios. So for corn, for every ton of corn grain that you produce about a ton of residue material. For wheat and rice, the numbers are a little bit higher. And for sugarcane, I think Charlie showed the number yesterday. And forest residues, again, a sawmill. How many of you have visited a sawmill? Okay, a sawmill, when you go there, you'll see huge piles of scrap wood and sawdust, which is the result of cutting the tree, and that's about as much waste as the final product. So it's a lot of biomass available there. And in this case, sustainable would be if the trees are being harvested sustainably and renewably, then the waste would be considered sustainable. And then you have animal waste, municipal solid waste, and dedicated energy crop production. So these are the sources that most of my work has focused on, understanding how to use these kinds of biomass and less on the first generation feedstocks. So these are the sustainability issues that I'm going to talk about a little bit. I'm going to take my jacket off. So again, you've seen all of these in previous slides from Swani and Charlie. And I'll just give you my perspective on each of these, starting with water, both quantity of water and quality. So this is just a cartoon that shows sort of the way water flows in a biofuel system. And this is actually from a pretty good reference that BP, the oil company, actually put out, Water in the Energy Industry. So you have your biomass growing over here. Your root system might be taking water either from the ground or from irrigation or from precipitation. And then you have to worry about water runoff into the surface water bodies. You might be taking water to a treatment plant from those bodies and using that for your biomass energy conversion. You send some sort of virtual water out of the conversion plant with the product that you're making. And then your biomass is coming in and being converted into, say, fuel, and then you might use some for heat and power generation. Some of the water might be recycled, as they do in Brazil, and put back as irrigation. So you have quite a complex set of flows that you have to worry about, including the groundwater flow. So this is a map that shows how much in cubic kilometers per year of water goes in different regions of the world into different activities. So this is agriculture here, this is industry, and this is households. So you can see that the largest consumption of water by far is in agriculture. This little piece here is biofuels. So biofuels are tiny right now. And the other interesting thing to show here is that the color of the outflows of water represent sort of the level of pollution that comes out of these various systems. So with agriculture, a lot of the water goes back to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. And then a fair amount of the water also goes back to the surface, but you can see it's a darker color, meaning it's potentially been contaminated through, for example, nitrogen fertilizer and other activities in the agricultural sector. With energy, you have primarily the impact is on raising the temperature of the water that you use. And then for industry and domestic uses, you have untreated wastewater can go into the surface and so on. So right now biofuels is a tiny piece of this, but locally, of course, it's going to be quite important and how it affects water. So I thought it would be useful just to have a feel for how plants use water, and that we have this water use efficiency term, which is basically, it's defined as the amount of biomass that we make per hectare per year divided by the amount of water that's required to do that, evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration means if you put a dome over the top of the, my pointer is dying a little bit. Is there a fresh battery, something? No. This is dying a little bit. I can't see. Is it a battery? No, the pointer. Okay, thank you. So if you put a dome over this growing plant, you'll have water that's evaporating out of the soil. You have water that evaporates, transpires through the plant and then evaporates, and all that together is evapotranspiration. And the amount of evapotranspiration is what's in the denominator here. So how much above ground biomass per evapotranspirated water. And so C3 plants and C4 plants, this is another category of basically desert plants. I won't talk too much about that. But C3 and C4, you can see the above ground productivity is higher for C4, and the water use efficiency is higher as well. Okay. And so you can translate this water use efficiency into how much water you need per hectare per year to grow a particular crop. And that's the last number down at the bottom, and the numbers are quite large in terms of tons per hectare per year. Great, thank you. So there's something called the vapor pressure deficit in a plant, and this is the difference in the, how many of you have had a thermodynamics course? Okay, good. So this is the difference in the vapor pressure outside the leaf and inside the leaf. And inside the leaf, it's typically saturated with vapor, and so the evapotranspiration is driven by the outside relative humidity. So the drier it is outside the leaf, the more you're going to evapotranspirate water. And so this vapor pressure deficit is 1 minus the relative humidity times the saturation vapor pressure at a given temperature. So this is as the temperature goes up, the saturation vapor pressure goes up. So you have this combination of temperature and relative humidity that determine how the plant is going to evapotranspirate water. And you can see the vapor pressure deficit in different climates. So in the tropical area, it's quite low because it's quite humid outside the leaf as well as inside the leaf. But when you go into drier areas, you get very high vapor pressure deficits, which mean you're going to drive a lot of water through the plant. And you can use this vapor pressure deficit to normalize the water use efficiency, and it lets you then make a better comparison between, say, C3 plants and C4 plants. So the the normalized water use efficiency, these are for different plants, soybeans, canola, wheat, and willow. And the numbers are much closer together than they are for without the normalizing factor. So these are in different climates. You can see Sweden, Argentina, Australia, and the numbers are quite close together. And so typically around 0.05 for this metric. C4 crops, again, in different places, England, Australia, India, US, quite different climates. And again, the numbers are relatively close to each other, and you can see that the normalized water use efficiency for the C4 plant is maybe twice that for the C3 plant. So the C4 plants use water much more efficiently is what the bottom line conclusion is here. And so we can use this water use efficiency to help estimate either how much water you need to get a given yield or how much yield you can expect in a given climate. So how much water do we need to produce a given yield of crop? It's evapotranspiration, that's the amount of water we need. This is the yield we want to get, multiplied by the vapor pressure deficit for that region, divided by this normalized water use efficiency. And I just did some examples here. If we wanted to get 18 tons per hectare per year of wheat, which is a nice yield of wheat, and the vapor pressure, the normalized water use efficiency for wheat is 0.045 in those units, and the growing season vapor pressure deficit in two different places, very different climates, England versus Egypt. You can see the vapor pressure deficit is much higher in Egypt because of the desert-like climate. And so the annual water that you require is going to be on the order of 400 millimeters versus 1,600 millimeters, right? And so you have to also then look at how much rain you might get to understand whether you could have rain-fed wheat production at this level in these places. Another example is miscanthus, which is an energy cane type crop. It's a very fast-growing grass, very tall grass. And I've looked at two different places in the US, Illinois and Nebraska. So Illinois is in the middle here. It's a very rich agricultural region. The Mississippi River runs right down here. Nebraska is a bit to the west, but a much different climate, much drier. And vapor pressure deficit is much higher in Nebraska than Illinois. The amount of rainfall that we would need to get a nice yield of miscanthus, 40 tons per hectare per year, is half the amount of water in Illinois as in Nebraska. But then you compare that with the annual precipitation, and you can see that the rainfall in Nebraska is much less than the water that you would require, whereas in Illinois you have far more water as rainfall than you do than you need for this kind of a yield. So you would expect that you could get good yields in Illinois just with rainfall, but in Nebraska you might need to irrigate to get that. So alternatively, you can ask the question, what yield should we expect in Nebraska for this miscanthus crop? And let's say that the growing season gets 300 out of the 400 millimeters of rain, and we can calculate the yield again from the same equation here, and we would expect something under 10 tons per hectare instead of the 40 that we would like to have. All right, so it's a quick and easy way to compare biomass, water requirements for biomass production. So Nebraska here, because of this deficit of water, this applies not only for an energy crop, but it also applies for food crop production. And right below Nebraska here is the state of Kansas, and this is a picture from a satellite of the Kansas cornlands. And these circles are it's hard to get a sense of scale, but these are large circles. And they are created by these irrigation systems that are called center pivot irrigation, which is a irrigation that's just circling like this around and around, and you get these beautiful green patches. But it requires a lot of water, as you can see. And where does that water come from? In the case of the U.S., this is Kansas here and Nebraska here. There's a giant underground aquifer, freshwater aquifer called the Ogallala, or the High Plains Aquifer. And this shows the layout of the aquifer, as well as the annual precipitation that comes with, so this is higher precipitation, and this is lower precipitation. So this is about 25, centimeters per year, and this is going to be on the order of maybe 40 or 50 centimeters per year. So that's what recharges the aquifer. Over here, it's hard to see, you can't really read it very well, but what this shows, the redder the area, the more the level of the aquifer has dropped over time. And it's, I can't read the numbers myself, but it's dramatic reduction in the level of the aquifer. So basically, in order to do this irrigation, we're mining water, fresh water, and not recharging it rapidly enough. So this is the concern when you're doing irrigation, is that you're going to run out of water resources. And this goes beyond even the economics. If you look at the economics of irrigation for energy crops, it's going to be very challenging. So in general, to be a sustainable bioenergy system, you're going to want to not use irrigation. And then the other issue that comes with water is that you have nutrient runoff, and again, this is a food crop somewhere probably near the Mississippi River in the U.S., but you're getting runoff of potentially of nutrients like nitrogen fertilizer, and you have a couple of risks with this. You can contaminate the shallow drinking water, and Suani talked about this as an issue with FERT irrigation, that there are limits on how much FERT irrigation is used so as to avoid contaminating shallow drinking water. We have the same kind of issue in the United States. All of this area here is where you have high level of nitrogen inputs. So the red is high inputs of nitrogen, and you also have a high vulnerability of groundwater contamination. And this is the agricultural region, the main agricultural region in the US, so a lot of it is at risk of this kind of contamination. And then you have sort of an even larger scale problem. If you look at this is the Mississippi drainage basin. So this is the Mississippi River here, and it drains all of this land, all of that, it flows into the Mississippi River, and then that dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico. So you have the Ohio River here, which is a major river. You have the Missouri River here, and all of these concentrate. And so this is basically the agricultural basin of the U.S. And it looks sort of like inside of a body maybe with blood vessels flowing, but you can see it all concentrates here. And this is the nitrogen inputs that come from agriculture. And you can see it's mostly most concentrated here. This is in kilograms per square meter per year. But it comes from all over this region, and it all flows. Anything that runs off that doesn't get used by the plants goes down to the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see this red formation here, hypoxia, which is the over-nutrients in the, too much nutrients being supplied into the Gulf of Mexico and creating algae blooms, which then cause die-off of fish and other ecological problems. So this is a big problem with agriculture, and again, if we're talking about bioenergy, we need to be worried about these kinds of things so that they're not they don't happen. Okay, so that was water and nutrients related to water. Land use change and greenhouse gas emissions. I have a question here. There you go.
Thanks, Professor. My name is Raquel. I'm here from Brazil. And about the water, I've heard someone saying that it's very critical. We are trying to change, like genetic modification for instance, like the water, the loss heat and like the water the water loss from the plant, so we can increase the productivity without using many water, especially in the dry place. So I would like to know your thoughts on that. Like, do you think that genetic manipulation can offer to us like some sort of solution, and or if you have done much of could do, or if you have like more room to improve? What's your opinion on that?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on that. I know that there are people who are thinking about that kind of strategy. Yeah, so but I hesitate to give an answer just because I'm not informed on it. I think sort of from a higher level, the concern when you start changing the genetics of the plant, people worry about sort of wild plants getting, or genetically modified plants getting out into the wild and creating other issues. So there's always unintended consequences, I think. But that is one direction I think people are working on to try to improve the water use efficiency. Yeah. Okay, land use change and greenhouse gas emissions. This is quite an interesting area, and a lot of thinking and writing and differences of opinion among different people. This I'm going to start with, there's direct land use change and then there's indirect land use change. So direct land use change is if you take a piece of land that is being used for some purpose today and you change to use it for bioenergy. So there's several different systems that have been shown, that are shown here. This is work that was published in Science a few years ago, and it helped draw attention to the issues of land use change with bioenergy. But so these are, for example, palm biodiesel, and if you change the ecosystem from say a tropical rainforest and change it to palm biodiesel, and this is in Indonesia, Malaysia, then the amount of carbon that you emit because you basically cut the forest is shown here, both above ground biomass carbon loss and below ground biomass carbon loss. So there's carbon in the soil which can be released to the atmosphere. So that's, by cutting the forest, that's how much carbon you release. And the idea is that if you have a biofuel, you're going to displace fossil fuels, and so you'll save fossil fuel emissions. And how long will it take you before you've paid back this carbon debt, essentially? Right? Is that clear? So in this case, you have a carbon debt of about, say, 700 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare. And the time it takes it's going to be 86 years before you pay that all back, before you get back to neutral, right? So after 86 years, if you're still using that land for biofuel, then you're starting to get benefits on the carbon side. And depending on what type of biofuel and what type of ecosystem you change, you can have very different carbon debt periods. And in general, so these are mostly first generation, and I'm sure I'll have a heated discussion about this one with Suani or Cortez. This is if you take Cerrado in Brazil and turn it into sugarcane ethanol land, the estimate is about a 17-year carbon debt. But again, the point here is that you have to look carefully at the specifics of the situation that you're dealing with. Out here, this is a case where we're using marginal or abandoned cropland, So there's a lot of, and I'll show you some numbers on this, there's a lot of abandoned cropland around the world. And if you do that, this is very poor. There's very little biomass on it to begin with, and there's not much carbon in the soil, so there isn't too much that you can have in the way of a debt. And essentially the payback time is immediate, right? So so that from a direct land use change standpoint, this is quite an attractive an option. So Suani has something to say.
Sorry to interrupt, just a small question. Of course, you are considering the worst case where we are doing deforestation to plant the crops. And at least in Brazil, the environmental legislation does not allow that. You cannot make deforestation to plant any crop. But in this case, also if you do the deforestation, even if it's not for biofuels and if it is for food, you have also the problem of carbon emissions. I mean, in Malaysia, when they did deforestation to plant palm oil for food, you have the same problem, is that so? Or if you plant sugarcane for sugar production, and if you do deforestation, you also have the negative impact. So better never to make deforestation and not at all, is that so? Just a question.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Deforestation is not something you want to do, or in general, changing a native ecosystem, whether it's forests or savanna. Yeah. So the point, the authors of this particular work, they actually were doing work on this idea of using abandoned lands. This is Dave Tillman at the University of Minnesota. So they were a little bit, and when you read the literature on biofuels, you have to be careful about the biases that are here. So they were perhaps skewing the analysis a bit to sort of favor their results. But this is potentially an interesting resource, and this is around the world. There's something like 450 million hectares of this land which has been abandoned because it's no longer productive. And if you can plant, if you can establish a perennial crop on this kind of land, even if it's low productivity above ground, you can get a lot of root biomass generated, and it's perennial, so you're not harvesting the whole plant every year. You're letting it grow back every year. You can end up building carbon into the soil, and over on the order of decades, 50, 60, 70 years, you can begin to bring that soil back into productive purpose, and for example, for food agriculture. So this is one idea that people have been looking at. We've done a little bit of looking at the possibilities here. The trouble with this is that the yield above ground, because the soil is not very productive, the yield above ground is quite low, and that makes the economics quite challenging. So that's direct land use change that I was talking about. Then there's a second category called indirect land use change, and this one is even more contentious than the direct land use change. And this was, Suani mentioned this fellow's name, Searchinger, and he's the one who first called the world's attention to this, and he happens to be also at Princeton University. And so I know Tim, and he's a very passionate guy, and he's been very successful, I would say, in getting the ear of a lot of policymakers, particularly in Europe. But the basic issue here is that if you take a piece of agricultural land, let's say in the US, corn growing land, that corn was used for food, and now we're going to convert it to ethanol instead, that food demand, the food that was produced has to be produced somewhere else. And Searchinger's argument was that, you know, it could be deforestation somewhere in the rest of the world that is done in order to grow more corn. And that deforestation has carbon emissions. And so that's the basic idea of indirect land use change, is that when you do something in one place, it has an effect somewhere else. And you know, the basic concept is correct, and the basic argument is generally accepted, but it's a very difficult one to quantify. You cannot experimentally determine what happened. You have to use models to say what happens in the agricultural system for example, half of the corn in the U.S. starts to be used for ethanol, what happens in the rest of the world? And there are many different models that are used, and you won't be able to read this very easily, but the idea here is that you can get just about any result that you want depending on what kind of model you use and what kind of assumptions you put into it. So this is, these are different biofuels. This is corn ethanol here. This is, I think, wheat ethanol, and so on. And if we just take one of these, and this is grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of biofuel. So it's essentially the amount of carbon emissions that we get per unit of biofuel that we make. And you can see that depending on where you are on the scale, you can be, somewhere around here is where fossil fuels would be. So you can see that you have to be you have to understand how the model was done, what the assumptions were, in order to be able to really assess whether the results make sense or not. And in the case of the way the United States Environmental Protection Agency does it is to, they just regulate and they say the indirect land use change impact is X of, say, corn ethanol or soy biodiesel, and they just they've looked at the models and made some decision about what the number is to use, and that's the way that's the way the bioenergy industry has to deal with it. Jose, how am I doing on time? Okay. Okay. So the indirect land use change. This is one of the most contentious issues in the bioenergy area. All right, energy and greenhouse gas balances now and let's leave out the land use change. Let's say we have second generation biomass. This is from some work that I did a few years ago. I'm showing the energy balances and the greenhouse gas balances for producing two different second generation biomass feedstocks. This is corn stover, which is the fiber from corn production. And this is mixed prairie grasses. So it's this idea of the abandoned croplands growing multiple species of essentially native grasses to try to restore the land. And I've shown the energy balances here and the greenhouse balances here. So let's start with corn stover. So the energy balance, overall, it requires about 1.1 gigajoules per dry ton of stover delivered. That's the amount of energy that we need to harvest it, to collect it, to bale it, and to take it to the conversion facility. And you can see that almost half of the energy input is to replace the fertilizer that to add fertilizer that you need because you've taken away some of the nutrients with the fiber rather than leaving the fiber on the field. So that's an important piece. And then transportation is important, and then some collection and baling of the material. And in the greenhouse gas balances is similar, but the fertilizer replacement is even larger here because of the fact that when you add nitrogen fertilizer, you get N2O emissions coming off the field, and N2O is much more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2. So that becomes the most important piece there. In the mixed prairie grasses now, there's no fertilizer requirement because we're reestablishing a native species without fertilization. So the most important energy contributor is transportation. And overall, the total turns out to be about the same for per gigajoules per dry ton. And then the greenhouse gas distribution is almost exactly the same as the energy distribution. So the conclusion out of this graph is that corn stover, the fertilizer replacement is most important. For the mixed prairie grasses, this was the way we did this analysis. We assumed that the grasses would be grown on what's called conservation reserve land, which is land that is specifically designated as not being allowed to be used for agriculture because it has certain character for annual agriculture, but you are allowed to plant grasses on it. So this land is rather dispersed and spread out, so that's why the transportation costs are quite large. But these numbers, so this is kilograms of CO2 per dry ton. It's about twice per dry ton for corn stover as mixed prairie grasses, but we don't really, we need to compare these numbers to something to understand whether these are large or not. And so what we can do is look at the energy content of biomass and the carbon content of biomass that we're producing. So each dry ton makes about has about 18 gigajoules of energy in it, and you compare that with about one gigajoule that we need to produce that ton. So that's a pretty good energy balance there. Not very much in. This is mostly fossil energy, and this is biomass energy. And then it's similarly for the emissions. Again, these numbers, 84 and 160, are much smaller than the carbon that we've taken out of the atmosphere by growing the biomass. So these are the energy balance and the greenhouse balances for these second generation feedstocks is quite good. Right. Any questions at this point? Okay. We'll keep going. All right, economics. So this is where I think ultimately is, if the economics don't work, then the system is not sustainable, right? So can't quite see the, so this is, the scale here is US dollars per liter gasoline equivalent. This is a pretty complicated graph. I'm going to take a little time to explain it. So it shows different biofuels. First, these are first generation biofuels. So this is sugarcane ethanol in Brazil. This is sugar beet ethanol in the European Union. This is corn ethanol in the US. This is wheat ethanol in the EU, biodiesel in the European Union, and soy biodiesel in Brazil. And for each of these fuels, there's 2 different years of data shown, 2004 and 2007. And the numbers haven't changed too much since then. But the point here is the same. So we've shown this pink area here is feedstock costs. The green is co-product value. So this is the walking stick that Cortez was talking about. That's a revenue source. And then the processing costs. This is the conversion of the feedstock into the biofuel. And then this is the energy costs for the processing. And then this shows the net cost. So it's all of the positive costs minus the walking stick revenue. And then the green bar in the middle here is what the fossil fuel price was in 2004, or basically the oil price in 2004 versus 2007. 2004, it was about $40 a barrel of oil for crude, and 2007 was about $70 a barrel for crude. So what do we take away from all of this information? These are things that Cortez said yesterday much more eloquently than I am. But feedstock is the main cost component, all right? So that's this piece here. In all cases, that's much bigger than the processing costs or the energy costs. So that's an important observation. So again, these are first generation biofuels. The feedstock cost is the most important. The co-product values, the walking stick, is also important because in some cases it's more important than others. The other is that the feedstock cost is highly variable. So this is 2 different years of production, and in this case it's corn in the US. So the corn price is almost double here what it was here. So you're subject to the fluctuations of the commodity food markets, essentially, is what this is saying. And then perhaps most importantly, that most of these biofuels are not competitive with fossil alternatives without subsidy. So this is the fossil energy price. This is the biofuel cost. here and here, here and here. The only place where it makes some sense is Brazilian ethanol, where the ethanol cost is comparable to or less than the fossil fuel cost. And so from this graph, you can understand why biofuels get subsidized heavily in the European Union and in the US as well, although the US has started to decline a bit, but not in Brazil anymore because they don't need the subsidies, right? So this is probably my main argument for why first generation biofuels are not sustainable, is that you can't continue to subsidize and grow an industry big enough to make a big impact. So second generation biomass now. So this was from that same study that I referred to earlier that we did. We looked at what the cost of delivering, and this is in dollars per ton, mixed prairie grasses or corn stover, and there are many different steps in the process to deliver the feedstocks to a conversion facility, and what we ended up with was a total cost in dollars per gigajoule of about 3.8, close to $4 a gigajoule for corn stover, and a higher cost for the mixed prairie grasses, again because of the low yields that we were getting there, about $7 a gigajoule. Those numbers probably don't mean anything without some comparisons. So crude oil at $70 a barrel is about $12 a gigajoule. Okay, so these look pretty good compared to crude oil. But in the US, natural gas and coal cost about $3 a gigajoule. And natural gas is a much easier feedstock to use for just about anything than solid biomass. So the feedstock is more convenient and cheaper than corn stover. So it's a hard, even before you start to convert the biomass, it's a challenge to see that the economics are going to be very attractive, at least in the U.S. context, right? The other thing that we did in this study was to look at how the scale of the facility of the conversion would affect the cost. So there are scale economies. The bigger you build things, the less it costs per unit of production generally. And so we looked at what the delivery cost would be for biomass at a delivery rate. So this number here is for a delivery rate of 1 million tons per year of biomass, which is a large, there are facilities today that bring 1 million tons per year to a conversion facility. But we looked at 500,000 tons, 2 million tons, 3 million tons, and so the cost does go up as you get larger, but the question is whether the conversion facility cost comes down more rapidly as you get larger and larger. And so you have this kind of a trade-off. You have the cost, so this is the cost of a biofuel production, say dollars per liter of production, and the biomass is increasing in cost because you're bringing more and more from further and further away, but your capital cost is coming down for the facility at some rate, and so if you put the two together, you have some kind of a minimum cost here that corresponds to a particular facility size, right? And this is a characteristic of second generation conversion processes, is that the capital cost is much higher, generally much higher than the first generation conversion. Again, because you're dealing with a non-food crop that's harder to convert, essentially. All right. So in our study, what we found is that if you continue to go out here with the biomass transportation, you actually, this line actually keeps going down, the blue one. It doesn't hit an optimum until you're very, very large. In fact, I've shown here how many trucks per hour you would have to unload in order to supply this biomass. And as you get to 3 million tons, you're unloading 23 trucks per hour, which is probably not feasible, right? So you're limited more not on the getting to an economic optimum, you're limited on how much traffic congestion you would have at a conversion facility. But this is an important characteristic to keep in mind, that second generation plants want to be larger to have better economics. So yeah, higher capital costs than first generation, but lower feedstock costs. And the costs are more sensitive to scale, so economies are generally optimized, economics are generally optimized at larger scale. All right, so I'm not going to talk too much about conversion technologies themselves, because Charlie covered that pretty well yesterday, but this is my sort of overview of it. We have second generation feedstocks. These are first generation feedstocks. You can put them through various processes that Charlie talked about and then make different types of energy. Low carbon electricity you can make in a lot of different ways. You don't have to use biomass, and since we are constrained in the way the amount of biomass that we can produce in the world, it might be better to save that for transportation fuels that contain carbon, and particularly things like jet fuel, which is, it's going to be hard to electrify airplanes, and we may need the fuel for that. So these are the kinds of systems that we've been studying in my group over the years, sort of advanced. I won't go through the details of these. If you're a chemical engineer, you might love to dive into some of this stuff, but this is for example, this is a gasification process where you take the biomass and you gasify it in oxygen, and Charlie talked about this yesterday. You clean up the gas, and then you put it through a Fischer-Tropsch synthesis process, which, as Charlie mentioned, was used back in World War II and before, but it makes a synthetic diesel or gasoline. You can also have some byproduct that is used to make power. And this also has the possibility of removing CO2 and capturing that, and I'll talk more about that idea tomorrow. But this gasification process, there's been a lot of work done to try to understand what the costs of this kind of a system would be if you had a demand and you had a reasonable price that you could get for the fuels, and but the problem is that there haven't been any of these plants built, and so the costs are very uncertain. And this is a graph that was in a paper a couple of years ago. This is the cost for this gasification-based conversion of either biomass or coal. You can use that gasification process for either. And you can see, so the biomass to liquids is these guys, coal to liquids is these guys, and so these are just different estimates that have been made, all for the same size of input of biomass, and you can see it's anywhere from 0.5 to almost 3. So nobody really knows what these things are going to cost until we start getting more experience to build them. So you have to be very careful when people tell you that something's going to cost, it's going to be too cheap to believe. It probably will be unbelievable. But there is learning that goes on, and Suani talked about this a bit. As you produce more and more of something, your costs are going to come down per unit for that. And this is a general learning. I won't go through the details of it, but here's an example. Maybe you'll hear more about this tomorrow. Is the wind energy, right? Yeah. So this is the costs of wind turbines in dollars per kilowatt over time, and both time and the cumulative installed capacity. So the more wind turbines that were built, the more the companies figured out how to make it cheaper and cheaper. And so as you build more and more, the cost comes down, and it turns out that you can plot this on a log plot and get a straight line. And roughly for mass-produced widgets, which is something that you can make in a factory, you get about a 20% cost reduction for every doubling of cumulative production. So that's kind of a general rule for things like laptop computers and small devices. Wind turbines are sort of modular that way. But it turns out that In Brazil, the ethanol industry has shown a similar kind of learning because there's been so much production that has gone on. This is the cost of ethanol, the conversion plants, and it's about a 19% cost reduction per doubling in the cumulative production. So there's been a lot of learning that has gone on, and it seems like it's still continuing potentially. This is actually the learning that has gone on with sugarcane production. So the cost of making sugarcane has come down as well, even faster than this. So there is evidence that if once we start doing something, we do get better at it and learn how to make it cheaper, and that's going to be essential for second generation biofuels. There's also lessons that go the other way. This is kind of an extreme one, but nuclear power in the U.S. and in France, this is dollars per kilowatt of nuclear power plant capacity, and costs have actually been going up with time because of the special features of nuclear. So it's not automatic that the costs will come down. In general, the more complicated the technology, the less likely the costs are to come down. But something to keep in mind. Do I have time to talk about algae? Huh? Okay, I gotta talk about algae. So this is only 2 slides. All right. So question mark about algae. So there's good news and not so good news. Is my sorry. So the good news is that you know, it's 3/4 ocean in the world, right? So there's potentially a lot of algae that we could grow. We don't have to use land, good quality land. We don't even have to use land. You can get very high yields because you're not limited by surface area. Now you have volume to use for growing algae. A few years ago, there were 100 startup companies investing in algae because everybody thought it was going to be the next, or at least the venture capitalists thought it was going to be the next big energy thing. So that was all good news. But if you go through the economics, you know, optimistically, you probably need $200 a barrel oil before it's competitive today, and it's not really proven at scale yet. So we might get better. If you want to reduce your costs, you really want to use a concentrated source of CO2 to feed the algae, and that both adds cost, but it also means that you're putting CO2 back to the atmosphere. For example, if you use fossil CO2, the carbon mitigation benefit is not that great, and I'll show you some numbers on that. And then you need lots of water handling because obviously algae grows in water, and moving around a lot of water costs money and energy. And this is just a rough calculation. How much water do you have to remove to make a liter of gasoline equivalent from algae? I won't go through the details here. The bottom line is that if you have a liter of gasoline equivalent with 100% conversion of algae into gasoline energy, you need to process about 1,800 liters of water. So that's a lot of water moving around that you have to do. But you know, that's a good engineering challenge for others to work on. So water is one issue. And then I think this might be my last slide. We just did a very rough calculation of what the greenhouse balance would be if you have a coal-fired power plant that normally would just send its electricity out to the atmosphere. Its CO2 out to the atmosphere. But now we're going to take that CO2 and put it into the algae pond. Some of that CO2 is not going to be absorbed by the algae, and it'll slip back to the atmosphere. But then we make algae, we convert it to fuel and make diesel fuel, and then we run our vehicles with that diesel fuel, and the CO2 comes out the tailpipe here. So we compared the greenhouse emissions for this on a life cycle basis against the possibility of just having a coal-fired power plant by itself and just using diesel fuel for the cars. So there are two systems that are providing the same amount of liquid fuel and the same amount of electricity, but one's doing it in this sort of using the CO2 twice, whereas the other one isn't. And the result is that we get about a 20% reduction in system-wide life cycle greenhouse emissions. So we do get a reduction because we've used the CO2 here to make algae, but it's not, it's not huge. It won't solve our carbon problem, but it might help until we figure out how to do something other than coal-fired power plants. So I'm not so optimistic about algae certainly not in the short term. In the long term, there are big companies like ExxonMobil that are making investments in algae because they think that if biofuel is going to make it in a very large scale, it's going to have to be through something like algae. But I don't think they believe that it's near term. Okay, so that's just a quick recap. I don't need to go through that. That's what we've talked about. And do we have any time for questions? Or a few minutes? Okay. So, questions? Yes.
Very interesting, Professor Eric. A great overview of the bioenergy problem. In this country here, there is a discussion on second generation biomass applied to sugarcane plain, because they have solved the plants that produce ethanol. They have sort of a good walking stick as well, because they produce electricity, and that has been a source of revenue for them. And I'm wondering, and the discussion is, should we burn the bagasse or try to transform it in second generation ethanol? The discussion is around this. I really don't see much reasons for investment for a second generation plant. Instead, it seems technological point of view. I don't know much about the environment point of view. If how is the competition between the burning directly, producing steam and powering a Rankine cycle, or having a second generation? The discussion is more or less this. You also have the vinasse problem, but this is a different question. That's the idea is going direction for gasification. But the previous one, that's one point people are discussing in this country.
Yeah, I think whether you go for second generation biofuels with bagasse or trash, or you use it to make electricity, if you use conventional electricity technology, we could do that today easily. The second generation biofuels is, I would say, not quite commercially viable yet. But in order to get there, there would have to be some demonstrations and some testing to do it. I think ultimately it's the value of the electricity versus the value of the liquid fuel. So if a company can get more per unit of bagasse for the electricity after they take away their costs, then that's the one that they're going to go for. And maybe the predictability of the electricity costs or electricity prices in Brazil versus the unpredictability of oil prices, there's a different risk there as well. So yeah, I don't have an easy answer for how to do it. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Hi. I just try to give a comment. Stand up. Okay. I'd like just to make a short comment on that. Here we have an additional difficulty, as Eric knows quite well. Our sugarcane sector is very conservative. Very, 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 very conservative. So even when we started to push for cogeneration and the electricity surplus production, it was a big fight to convince them. So finally, they realized that could be another source of revenue, and they went. I just saw show that we have now more or less half of the mills producing surplus. But you see, even consider that the sector has passed for several economic difficulties in recent years. It shrank a little bit, we reduced the number of mills. We still have, we had only 2 pilot plants for second generation, one in Alagoas, which shut down, the other here in São Paulo is Raízen, the big group, but not so much. So I think we have also all these issues related to this conservative behavior. And even consider economic difficulties, I think we also have to take this into account. So
yeah,
it's another challenge.
Yeah, I would say that there's no industry that I've encountered that isn't conservative. They're in the business of making money, and yeah. On the other hand, this is a little bit of a digression, but we have a professor in my center that studies psychology, behavior of people around energy issues, and both people and institutions. And she's defined something called status quo bias. So you're biased as an industry, or you're biased as a person toward what you know until the status quo changes, and then that becomes the new status quo, then you're biased towards that one, right? So getting that change, the first change that you talked about, to recognize that electricity is a good revenue source is an important first step. And yeah, anyway, so we had, okay.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. I was wondering, actually I have 2 questions. It was only 2 slides, but I will try to ask you about algae. If there is one, what will be the walking stick for algae? Because you are trying to convert it just for energy. And if there is one, I would like to know it. And there is any, for instance, I'm not researching that area, but I see that for algae, there is some possibility to convert it like using a Rankine cycle. See, we could reduce a lot of transportation of fuel if you install your site next to some kind of building or some kind of civil construction that will allow you to reach the fuel or sell it like a food or something else. What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think there are, and maybe you know more about what the byproducts might be, but there are byproducts I think that can come out of algae. I think the issue with any walking stick is how big is the walking stick compared to the fuel market. So the fuel market is huge, right? So but if you're relying on the byproduct to make the economics work, the market for that byproduct has to be as large as the fuel market. Otherwise, you'll saturate and you won't have the walking stick anymore. So that's just something and there are very few markets as large as energy markets. And so it's finding the walking stick that will allow a big scale up of bioenergy is challenging. But there will be, I think, niche, smaller markets where algae might fit because of its byproduct. But I'm not an expert on it, so I won't give you more than that. There's a couple questions over here, I think.
So you showed to us like that study with 2 kinds of feedstocks, the one you grow in the marginal land and the other one. That was for the upstream, right, for the feedstock. So I just wanted to know for the downstream, because I guess like for this kind of marginal lands, we need to grow mostly like grasses. So I don't know about the technologies, like do we have mature technologies for this, and do you think that the downstream is going to be even like it's because the upstream is really good for this kind of feedstock, and I just wanted to know for the downstream if it's not going to be so high, because maybe the technology, we need more fuel to power the system because of it's like more, the biomass is more difficult to convert.
Yeah, so I didn't talk too much about the downstream, but the technologies for making biofuels they're not commercial yet. Things like gasification or the fermentation biochemical conversion routes that have been tried in Brazil, they're not yet commercially established, but we've modeled a lot of those systems, and the efficiency is quite good, maybe 50% energy efficiency, which isn't too bad. So I don't think the feedstocks are challenging, more challenging than using corn grain or sugar juice, but that's what we have to deal with. But the process can be pretty efficient, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture. My question is about the debate around peak travel. We've seen that peak travel.
Peak travel, okay.
Yeah, we don't see anymore the peak oil debate after the reduction of the oil prices, and I've seen some articles talking about the peak travel, like the differences in the preferences of the newer generations regarding traveling, regarding living closer to the cities and not living in the suburbs, and preferring like being connected and sharing vehicles rather than owning their vehicles. And I have two questions regarding that. The first one is, how do you see that debate? If you see, some people say this phenomenon just happens in the U.S., so I wanted to know your opinion about that, if you think it's just locally, and what is the impact on the biofuel industry in the long run? And the second question is if you think this could happen in the rest of the world, and the impact in Brazil, for example, if the newer generations prefer to not own a car.
Well, you're a lot younger than me, so you should probably answer the question about the younger generations. It's, in the U.S., the travel per capita has leveled off now. So the average person drives, 12,000 miles or something per year. It's a large number, but it had always been climbing, but now it's started to level off, and maybe that's why some of the discussions that you're talking about have come on. It looks like maybe we've hit the peak passenger travel at least, but I think it's a long way from starting to come down in any dramatic fashion. I think much more important will be to increase the efficiency with which we generate those miles traveled. So in the U.S., we still have the CAFE standards, unless somebody gets his way and is able to cancel them. But the CAFE standards are the corporate average fuel economy standards, which are required by the automakers to make certain efficiency cars. So the average efficiency of a car in the U.S. today is about 25 miles per gallon. I don't know, I can't do the conversion quickly, but 25 miles per gallon. Within 7 years, it should be 55 miles per gallon. So a huge increase in the efficiency of vehicles is mandated by the law, and that will have much more impact than waiting for people to saturate on their travel, I think. And I think the rest of the world is, the U.S. is probably one of the highest traveling countries, and in part because it has such a good infrastructure, or that makes traveling easy, but other countries are still building that infrastructure, I think. So I think travel is going to continue to increase in other countries. But it would be if people started living more closely in cities, that would certainly have an important impact. But I think it's a harder change than to change the technology. So.
Hello, my name is Regiane. I'm from Brazil, from University of Campinas. And according with the data you presented, bioenergy is not enough to be the only renewable energy to be used in the future. So if we consider Brazil as an example where the first generation ethanol is enough to compete with oil source, and we are able to produce in an economic way that's viable to use, what do you think would be another source of renewable energy that would be used together with ethanol in this case to complete the need of energy that we have? And do you think it's possible to use the biomass that is produced, like the lignocellulose biomass, to produce chemicals in this case?
So the second question first, the chemicals, yeah, that's an easier market to get into because the value is much higher than fuels. So, and some of the companies that started out aiming to do second generation biofuels, they've in fact changed direction and doing chemicals and pharmaceuticals and things like that, and so they're able to stay in business and maybe in the long term develop the second generation biofuel technology. So I think that is a viable route to start. As far as something to complement ethanol in Brazil or elsewhere, you know, a lot of people are interested in the idea of power to fuels. So making hydrogen electrolytically from water and then combining with CO2 that you capture from the air, for example. But the economics of that are, I would say, far from near term. Another idea is that if you capture CO2 from, say, fermentation, and you store the CO2 below ground, your bioethanol is now negative emission fuel, and that essentially leaves some room in the atmosphere to use petroleum. So you could have a mix of still use some petroleum, but still have net zero greenhouse gas emissions, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that more this afternoon.
Okay, and in this case, do you think the first generation ethanol in Brazil is considered sustainable? Because it's a first generation, so.
It seems pretty sustainable to me from what all the metrics that I went through, the water issues, the land competition issues, the economics especially.
So it would be viable continue burning the bagasse to produce electricity and keep the first generation just also?
I think that would be I would consider that a sustainable system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. One more question?
Yeah, I think that considering this idea of carbon capture, as I said yesterday, we had a few examples in Brazil. In Paraná, we have a Copacana, a sugar mill, selling CO2 to produce chemicals, sodium carbonate, and also CO2 to be used in greenhouse to grow wood, logs, and other woods. So also, maybe this would be easier than capture and storage. So this is something we have been studying, that maybe the use for chemicals and for other uses together with the biofuels. And I think you are going to discuss this afternoon a little bit.
I will talk about that a little bit. The problem with I think what you're suggesting is a good initial use for the CO2, greenhouses and chemicals and so on. But it's the walking stick problem with scaling up the industry. There are not that many greenhouses compared to cars on the road, right? So you'll run out of places to use the CO2 unless you do something else. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. If I may, what do you think about what is the role of the municipal solid waste as a bioenergy? Because as far as I know, if I have money, I will not build a facility to burn municipal solid waste to generate electricity. I will have something, I will need a walking stick to, like, no, I have to make a contract also to collect, and then this contract will be profitable, and I have this, I will have this to make something to be more, more sustainable. What do you think that will be the whole of municipal solid waste?
I think that's an important potential bioenergy source. There's some technical challenges with using it because of the contaminants that are in it. It can be difficult even just for simple burning. But there are ways to deal with that, and in Europe they do quite a bit of that. But the walking stick in that case is that, for example, in New York City pays maybe $100 per ton to somebody to take the MSW, right? And so if you're a generator, you get paid to take the feedstock. That's a negative feedstock cost. That's essentially like the walking stick in the economics. So I think if you can get technology that works, and the other problem in the United States is the NIMBY problem. Does anybody know the acronym NIMBY? Yeah, not in my backyard, right? And there's another one called banana. Anybody know that one? Build, banana build. Don't build anything anywhere near anybody or something like that. But it's the social opposition to it, because concern about air pollution, which can be dealt with through technology, but people are afraid of it. So that's another, not something that engineers are probably going to solve. Should we, any more questions, or should we have lunch? Are we done? Okay, we're done then. Thank you.
Lunchtime. We'll come back at 2.